I am delighted to be here with Professor Bradley Lepper from the Ohio History Connection. Bradley, you are, as far as I can tell, one of the leading experts in the world on the Hopewell culture of the United States.
I suppose I'm one of the people working on these problems quite a lot and for much of my career.
Yeah. Well, you're the leading expert that I could find to talk about these things. The Hopewell culture is one of these archaeological phenomena that I think a lot of people haven't heard of. But as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the most interesting in the entire world. When I first read about it, it blew my mind. The scale of some of these archaeological sites, built with very primitive, to our minds, tools. So like bone tools and things like this. And they're building these massive, massive sites. I mean, maybe you could just introduce some of, the main Hopewell sites for us.
Sure, and just to speak to your that sense of amazement about this, it's absolutely true that these magnificent giant earthworks were created with simple technology, but the reason that these sites are now World Heritage Sites, the outstanding universal value that allowed them to be recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site relate to the fact that this monumental architecture was created by indigenous people that didn't live in cities, that didn't have corn, that didn't have hierarchical society with a king at the top. So it was a bunch of small independent communities working together voluntarily to create this monumental architecture. So it's like when I teach at the university and I talk about civilizations, we have these like 7 or 8 different criteria. And Hopewell has only one of them. It has the monumental architecture, but none of the other things that supposedly were required for societies to build great architecture and to have, to feed the numbers of people that would be coming to these places. So it really is a kind of a mystery how these people were able to do what they did from a purely sort of egalitarian, cooperative society with no kings, with no authoritarian leaders. And they not only did it in one place, they did it all over southern Ohio. And in fact, the extent of Hopewell culture goes across much of North America. There are similar kinds of things being built in Missouri and in Florida, as far east maybe as New York. So the southern Ohio is definitely the core, but sort of reverberations and influence extended much, much greater. The earthworks I know best are 2 of the earthworks that are part of the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Octagon earthworks and the Great Circle. These are monumental earthworks. The Great Circle, is 1,200 feet across. That's 4 American football fields. You could stretch inside that. The circle and the octagon that are connected, the Octagon earthworks, that's a circle that has a slightly smaller diameter of 1,054 feet. And the octagon encloses 50 acres, which means you could put 4 Roman Colosseums inside just the octagon. That's some of the scale here.
Yeah, you say the slightly smaller one. It's still massive, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Still absolutely massive.
Yeah. These are incredibly huge earthworks. And an architectural historian that worked with us on the nomination, John Hancock, now retired from the University of Cincinnati, talks about it as being architecture of a kind that he never learned about in architectural school. And he refers to it as uncanny in terms of its scale and simultaneously its precision. So this 1,054 feet diameter circle, the observatory circle connected to the octagon, is about as perfect a circle as we could build today. So, and it wouldn't have to be that precise. 2,000 years ago, if you're building a circle on that scale, nobody's going to notice if it's off a little bit, but maybe because of its lunar alignments, it's aligned to the moon. So maybe they're trying to get the attention of the spiritual being that is the moon and convince them that they've got it right in some way.
So yeah, they did have to get it right, really, in many ways. I was reading that you think that the Newark earthworks are actually aligned to the celestial bodies, and they are sort of early forms of astronomy.
Yes, and it's not just me that thinks that. I think that because of the work of physicist and astronomer Ray Hively and a philosopher Robert Horn at Earlham College, that early on, back in the 80s, um, and it's worth a little bit of a digression to talk about this because they weren't out to prove anything. They were doing their work at about the time that Gerald Hawkins had come out with his book about Stonehenge Decoded, which was arguing that Stonehenge was this elaborate astronomical computer. And Ray and Bob didn't believe it. They said, no, it's just that Stonehenge is a complicated monument, and you can draw so many lines through it that just by happenstance, some of them will inevitably point to a solstice or an equinox alignment, or even both. So the idea was that if you put Stonehenge on a roulette wheel and spun it 1,000 times, 997 times out of 1,000, it would come out with these alignments. So it's just happenstance because it's complicated and you can draw so many lines. Is that these ancient people weren't that smart. They weren't paying attention to what was going on in the sky. It's just happenstance. And they were teaching a course on the history of cosmology at Earlham College and wanted to include this as a sort of critical thinking exercise. And they couldn't take their students to Stonehenge. But Bob Horn had been to Newark, and he said Newark's Octagon is a complicated environment, or a complicated monument. It's got these 8 sides with the walls pointing in 2 different directions. It's got all these gateways, and you could draw different lines between the gateways. And just by chance, there will be a solstice or equinox alignment there. And so they brought their students there to do this exercise. And they assumed, oh, look, there's a solstice alignment here. But it's not real. It's not intentional. It just happens to be here because if you put the octagon on a roulette wheel and spin it 1,000 times, those alignments would show up in a very high frequency. So they go there, they do all this mapping, draw every line they could, and can't find a single solstice or equinox alignment. And they were scratching their heads because like that's statistically significant. So it then occurred to them that, well, maybe it's not lined up to the sun because it's lined up to something else. And that's when they found that the main axis of the site points to the northernmost rise of the moon. One of the walls points to the southernmost rise of the moon. Other lines you draw through it point to actually all 8 of the moon rises, the 4 moon rises on the eastern horizon and the 4 moon sets on the western horizon that define the northernmost rise and the southernmost rise and the northern minimum and the southern minimum. So it's hard to imagine that that's a coincidence. And they actually then went on to look at the other circle and octagon in Chillicothe, the High Bank Works. It's oriented at 90 degrees to Newark's Octagon and is about 60 miles away. It also has all of those alignments incorporated into its architecture.
It's wild. So the main Hopewell earthworks, the ones that were made UNESCO World Heritage Sites, there's like 5 or 6, right? Do you want to just speak of them? And then there's also, is it hundreds of other sites as well? Smaller sites that have smaller earthworks?
I suppose... I mean, we have had over, I think Ohio had some 10,000 mounds found in the state. There's only a couple of thousand now that are documented. But some of these are
10,000.
Yeah, 8 to 10,000, something like that.
Just in Ohio.
Yeah, just in Ohio. Some of them are simply small conical mounds that are burial mounds built by the Adena culture, which preceded the Hopewell culture. Some of them are small circles, maybe 200 feet in diameter, that were probably like the churches, the community churches of some of these cultures, because that's about the size of what a community church would have been like for these communities. But then you have these really large enclosures, and there's probably 20 to 30, 40 of those. So it's not in the thousands of these giant enclosures. Those places were special. And we have 8 of them that make up the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks. It includes Newark's Great Circle and Octagon. It includes the Fort Ancient earthworks, which are a giant hilltop enclosure. I mean, it's called Fort Ancient because the early Europeans thought it was reminiscent of an Iron Age hill fort. It's got 3.5 miles of walls that surround these hilltops and an interior ditch that held water. So we can talk more about that later if you like, but it shows they're not just geometric earthworks. They're also sort of topographically defined earthworks. And then, so those 3 sites are owned and operated by the Ohio History Connection. But then there's 5 sites that make up Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. And that includes the Hopewell Mound Group, the largest of the Hopewell enclosures, and one of the ones that was first studied and has produced probably some of the most iconic Hopewell artifacts that have helped define the culture. There's the Site Mound in Earthworks. There's Mound City, and right across the river, there's the Hopeton Earthworks. And then there's the High Bank Earthworks, which is the other circle and Octagon. And these are certainly the best preserved and among the most iconic, but there are many others that would have qualified if they had survived, if they hadn't been destroyed by farming or development. So there are many others that could have been named. But then one of the limitations is that in the United States, to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, there's an office in the Department of the Interior that governs that. And before they even consider you for World Heritage inscription, you have to either be a National Park Service site or a National Historic Landmark, which is like the highest designation the United States government gives to heritage sites. So you've already got to meet sort of the highest standard in the United States to even be considered to go on to that next step. And many sites, like we have Fort Hill, which is an Ohio History Connection site, that's a Hopewell site, that's probably better preserved than even the Fort Ancient Earthworks, but it's a bit smaller, but it's only on the National Register. It's not a national landmark. Someday, if that becomes a National Historic Landmark, maybe we can get that added to this set of earthworks.
So we've got sort of many churches, and then we have a few cathedrals, just to put it into our sort of Western way of thinking.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. It's a lot of effort to make these things. What do you think they were for? I mean, normal person goes to one of these things. What are they doing there?
I think, and this is an argument I've particularly made for Newark, that I think these places are religious. I mean, that's the whole nomination for UNESCO is the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. They're places where I think pilgrims were coming from literally the ends of their world. And I can say that because of the kinds of regalia that have been found in these mounds. Ohio, of course, is sort of in the Midwest, sort of up towards the northeastern section, and it's got the Great Lakes above it and the Ohio River below it. But artifacts found in Hopewell Mounds in Ohio include conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico. It includes fossil shark teeth from the Atlantic coast, mica from the Carolinas down on the southern Appalachian Mountains, and even obsidian, a volcanic glass that we know because of its chemical fingerprint. Most of it came from Obsidian Cliff in Yellowstone Park, about 2,000 miles away in the Rocky Mountains. So artifacts crafted from all these materials have been found in Hopewell Mounds. And I think the best explanation for that is that pilgrims are coming from great distances, bringing offerings of cool stuff from where they live to present at the sites. There they were crafted into ceremonial regalia. Like some of that obsidian was turned into things that look like spear points, but they're about a foot long or more. So they're symbolic spear points. And then those in turn were broken up into pieces and burned on altars as offerings. But then that's why the earthworks.
So they're longer spear points than they would be normally.
Yeah, I mean, the spear point is like this big, and it's made out of glass. So you're not really going to use that as a carving knife or a spear. And in fact, just a few years ago, the Seneca Nation funded a project for looking at use wear on that obsidian. Obsidian is the edges are so fine that you can get traces of use wear if you cut butter with it practically.
Yeah,
and an archaeologist from Canada and Ohio headed that study, and they found no traces of use wear. They found evidence at the bottom that they'd been hafted probably onto poles and maybe carried around in ceremonies, but they were never used for anything except symbolism.
Wow. Okay. It's such a massive map, really, at the time, isn't it? I mean, do we think that are people travelling from one side of the world to the other at that point, of this Hopewell world? Would there be a trade mission from, say, northern Florida all the way up to, I don't know, Michigan?
Well, trade is certainly part of it, because we see that happening in the earlier cultures. And you do get copper from the Great Lakes showing up further south. So trade is part of it. But I think in the case of the Hopewell, it doesn't make sense as simply trade, because then why do you need these gigantic enclosures? Those aren't community
Mm.
churches serving a local congregation. Those are giant cathedrals, as you say, where thousands of people bringing offerings from widespread places, are bringing these offerings. And when I was an undergraduate, it was talked about the Hopewell Trade Network. But if you look at obsidian in particular, which is in the Rocky Mountains, for trade, there's this drop-off curve. So the people that live in Yellowstone have all the obsidian they want, and they can trade large quantities of it to people living nearby. Then those people have a lot of obsidian. They can trade a big chunk of theirs to the next village. But as you keep going east, the piles that are being traded get smaller and smaller and smaller until they vanish. So before you get to the Mississippi River, there's no more obsidian. But if you continue sort of going east, suddenly there's a big spike of obsidian in southern Ohio. So it's not trade from village to village. It's somebody has brought gobs of obsidian big enough to be able to make giant spear points out of them from Yellowstone and then presented it at these ceremonial places.
So interesting. So it's all coming to southern Ohio, and it's all ending up there. Why there? Why the Chillicothe Valley? What is it about the place?
There's geography that makes sense. That's a part of a big river system. I mean, you can canoe from Yellowstone Park to Mound City just following rivers without ever having to ford anything.
Wow.
You go down the Yellowstone to the Missouri, and the Missouri to the Mississippi, and the Mississippi to the Ohio, and the Ohio to the Scioto, and get off at Mound City. So that's one thing. But for me, I mean, that the heart of the question, why Newark, why Chillicothe? For me, it's like asking, why Jerusalem, why Mecca? But you don't have a Quran or a Bible to tell it to you. Because as far as we know, we don't have any evidence of a recorded writing for the Hopewell. They may have recorded stuff on birch bark scrolls like the Ojibwe. Maybe they made knotted cords like the Inca quipu. But none of that has been preserved in the acidic soils in Ohio. So we have no evidence of recording information like that, except for the fact that they, had made lunar observations for probably a century to figure out the lunar cycle. So some of that seems like it should be written down, unless it could be incorporated in songs or prayers that the oral traditions would preserve. So yeah, without that recorded knowledge, I don't know what we do. We can't answer the question of why Newark, why Chillicothe.
Yeah, if only some sort of historical record had survived. But it makes it more of an enigmatic culture, doesn't it? Because we only have archaeology to tell the story. But it also makes it a little bit tragic, because in the wake of not having that history, when Europeans arrived, we made up a load of history for the place, didn't we? I suppose we could talk about that a little bit, because sort of when the European settlers crossed over the Appalachians, they entered this, beautiful landscape, and they found these giant earthwork constructions, and they had to explain it somehow. I guess maybe you could let us know what the early ideas were.
Well, they refused to even consider, or at least many of them refused to even consider the idea that the indigenous American Indians built them, because they considered those people to be savages. And these were obviously the works of a great civilization. And because of the sophistication of the architecture and the geometry, they assumed it must have been a white people civilization, because only white people are smart enough. So they invent this hypothetical culture that they called the mound builders, which were the builders of the mounds, and they were here first and created this grand civilization. And then the indigenous American Indians were latecomers who come, from Asia, sweeping into America like barbarian hordes and exterminate these civilizations, leaving only the mounds behind. And part of that is just pure racism. Part of it is many of the indigenous people living in North America at the time that Europeans arrived didn't have or wouldn't report to Europeans traditions about those mounds. They had been covered with forests, so it appeared that they had been disused for centuries. So, but what the Europeans didn't understand was that, I mean, cultures change over time. So those earthworks may well have not been used very much over many centuries. But when Europeans first arrived, they brought with them diseases, which swept through America ahead of the Europeans themselves. Maybe 90% of indigenous people in America died from those diseases, many of them before they ever even saw a European. Then Europeans came in and using warfare, disrupted all the tribes, moved tribes around, exterminated some tribes. So when they finally get to Ohio, can it be a shock that many of these people, like the Delaware, they were in New Jersey. They get pushed west and west, further west, and they end up in Ohio. Of course, now, because of the Indian Removal Act, all of them were removed to allotments or reservations in Oklahoma or originally Kansas. So for generations, they've been separated from the land. They've been forced, their kids have been forced to go to Indian schools and sort of re-educated so that those oral traditions often are not part of their upbringing. So how can we be surprised that these indigenous people now don't necessarily have traditions that they can point to explain that it was their ancestors? But we have indigenous people now coming back to these sites as part of the World Heritage effort. We brought them back. Chief Glenna Wallace with the Eastern Shawnee was one of the ones that instituted this, because she came back herself with some tribal members, got really excited about it, and became a very big supporter of World Heritage. And with World Heritage, she has often said in public speaking programs that all of her life, she only ever heard her ancestors referred to as savages. But because of World Heritage, she now hears her ancestors being referred to as geniuses.
Brilliant. I'm interested in how long it took for the sites to get the designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I mean, was that in the works for a long time?
Yeah, I think the first time, I mean, some of us were dreaming about it and thinking that they deserved it
I
for
bet.
years. But
Yeah.
I think it was 2003 that we did a site management plan for the Newark Earthworks. And that's the first time it's getting written down. One of the goals is get the Newark Earthworks nominated for a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But then nothing really happened for another, I don't know, decade or so. And then the Department of the Interior sort of opened up its tentative list for new nominations. The tentative list, you're probably familiar with that designation. It's sort of like a short list of sites from which the governments will pick to nominate. And so that opened up, and then we did sort of a preliminary UNESCO nomination to try to get on the tentative list. And that nomination was successful. So we get on the tentative list, and then we start doing the research, we start doing the work. And it was 20 years, I think, of research, of consulting with indigenous tribes before we finally get the nod and get the nomination. And it was a chore, but boy, it was a labor of love.
Yeah. Well, great work. Great work. Have you seen an increase in visitors since the designation?
Yes, both the Ohio History Connection sites and the Hopewell Culture National Historical Park sites have. We started seeing it even when we got on the tentative list, because it was starting to build the energy, and we were writing columns and papers and trying to get support, local support from communities for this World Heritage Initiative. It was going to be a big thing for those communities. Some of them are rural, and to have lots of visitors from foreign countries coming in might be a kind of a culture shock for some of them. So we wanted that. We wanted to be prepared. Maybe they could be developing their infrastructure, having more hotels, better roads, better restaurants. And some of the communities have taken up that challenge, because we found that communities that invest more do get more return. People that go to the World Heritage Sites say, yeah, this was a great place to visit. There were these great hotels and these great restaurants in addition to the wonderful earthworks. And so it's an economic boost for the not only just the 3 counties where these sites are located, but also places like Columbus and Cincinnati and Cleveland where there are airports with people coming in.
One of those people was me last year, and I had a fantastic time. And I've been telling everybody about it ever since, because they're just, I mean, there's just many things that are really interesting about those places. Another question I wanted to ask you about is the diet of these people, because you mentioned briefly this is before corn.
Yes.
So there's no kind of, massive fields of corn like the Mississippian cultures would have later. This is, it's partly hunter-gatherer, right?
Yeah, they're hunters, fishers, gatherers, but they also have gardens, sometimes probably pretty big gardens, of what's called the Eastern Agricultural Complex. Not corn, but they have things like sunflower, squash, goosefoot, little barley, plants that are indigenous, and they actually domesticated them. And in some places, like at Fort Ancient, where scientist Kendra McLaughlin has done soil cores in the ditches at Fort Ancient that still have water in them, and has found that when the Hopewell were there was massive deforestation to clear the land, I suppose, but also not only to clear the land for earthworks, but to clear the land for large gardens of the Eastern Agricultural Complex that probably were part of the feasting that would be taking place at these ceremonial centers on particular occasions.
So we're talking within the walls of Fort Ancient, they were doing horticulture?
Probably not, because the insides of these enclosures...
Probably not within the walls.
Yeah, but the Fort Ancient earthworks include like these 3 separate components: the South Fort, the Middle Fort, and the North Fort. And radiocarbon dating suggests that the South Fort was built first. So it may be that where the North Fort would subsequently be built were used as fields for the ceremonies that were taking place in the South Fort. But as it expanded and became ceremonial space, those gardens would have been moved to different adjacent areas.
Interesting. Very interesting. I don't think we've even spoken about dates yet. I mean, we are talking, this is 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, the dates
what are the exact dates?
The exact dates that we're using for the nomination, that we used for the nomination, were 1 to 400 CE. And it doesn't mean that there wasn't Hopewell going on earlier or maybe even later, but that seems to be the tightest range. And in fact, some of us, like me, think that range will even contract further, because how on earth people could sustain this kind of construction, with the societies that they had. It's remarkable that it was sustained for those 300 years, but to have it even 100 years seems like an amazing achievement.
Absolutely. This is generation after generation after generation. Do you have any sort of hypothesis on when people were coming to these places? I read these are quite dispersed people throughout the landscape, and they would possibly come maybe once a year, maybe twice a year. Any thoughts on that?
Maybe even once every 18.6 years to Newark, that's when the northernmost rise of the moon would align to the axis. And the thing about that is...
It's very precise. Very precise.
It's hugely precise. But people even like in Yellowstone Park in Wyoming 2,000 years ago, if they followed the moon, they would know when the northernmost rise was going to be and could say, okay, it's going to be in a couple months. It's time to load up the canoes and get started journeying to Newark for that big pilgrimage. But I don't think the astronomical alignments of the earthworks were just intended to be a giant calendar. I think that aligning those astronomical alignments with the architecture was a way... I've referred to Newark as a ceremonial machine. So I think it was like these gears that would align with the gears of heaven. And by sort of aligning the earthworks with the rhythms of the cosmos, you were making what happened in those earthworks more sacred. And sort of windows, the highway to heaven would open up on that northernmost rise of the moon, with those first beams of moonlight shedding along the axis of Newark, and the other sites in Chillicothe that also had those alignments.
So it's a connection to the divine. It's
yes.
It's very interesting. I mean, what do we think? Is this a priesthood?
It's an interesting question, because it does seem like they've gone beyond the sort of shamanistic religions where there are healers and things like that, these do seem to be people. I mean, like the geometry that's incorporated into these earthworks, which is and the astronomy. But like at Newark, you've got the circle and the octagon, and you've got the great circle, and you've got a square, and then you've got an oval where the burial mounds were. And the great circle, I can't remember the circumference. The diameter is 1,200 feet, but it's connected to a square. The circumference of the great circle is equal to the perimeter of the square that it's attached to. The area of that square is equal to the diameter of the observatory circle that's attached to the octagon. And then the octagon, if you draw a square inside it from opposite corners or alternative corners of the octagon, the sides of that square are equal to the diameter of the circle that it's attached to, that 1,054 feet. And the area of that square with 1,054 feet on a side is equal to the area of the great circle. So you've got more or less and deeper hidden geometrical connections between all these enclosures that are being built there. And that's not accidental, but it's not something that every pilgrim that comes to that site would know. So I think there is a kind of a priesthood that is, using geometry, using astronomy, and maybe there are different levels of initiation into that priesthood. And so you've got people that are high priests, that are the ones that know it all and know exactly when the northernmost rise of the moon is. But what's fascinating is those people seem to have very high status within the precincts of the ceremonial centers. But when they go home, they're living in the same kinds of houses that everybody else lives. They're doing the same work. They're hunting, fishing, and gathering, hoeing their gardens. But they're buried in the mounds with all this regalia that makes them look like kings. But they're not kings. They're priests with huge spiritual influence, but they don't have this authoritarian ability to order people around.
How interesting. How interesting. It's it seems like a different society than Cahokia and the Mississippians who came after.
It's enormously different. I mean Cahokia is a city.
Yeah.
It's 20,000 people, and it's got this pyramid with a king living at the top that, when they study his bones, he never worked a day in his life, and he had more access to meat than everybody else.
Yeah.
And all the other people
Absolutely.
that he literally looks down on are just eating corn and having their teeth rot out.
Yeah. And he's doing that all year round. He's not going back to a village with everybody else.
Exactly.
Really interesting. I mean, the Cahokia almost seems sort of the Mesoamerican sort of model, whereas to me, Hopewell, it's almost a bit Neolithic. I mean, what do you think of that? Because it's sort of, I think we've spoken about that. I mentioned this before, that the Newark earthwork is very similar in size to Avebury Stone Circle in the UK.
During the development of our World Heritage nomination, we've had conversations and had visits from Tim Darville and Lionel Sims. And we sort of all see that, okay, this is kind of the same thing. It's different manifestations of the same kind of thing. People sort of on the cusp of agriculture are, seeing these connections and making ceremonial places that are, defined by cosmic rhythms. And they're going in different directions, but they're kind of parallel in many ways.
Yeah. And even within the Americas as well, I recently saw there's a Brazilian state called Acre, and there's a bunch of earthworks that have been discovered there by farmers. I think deforestation, unfortunately, is what led to their discovery partly, and the LiDAR's been done on them. Have you seen about this?
Yes, those are crazy. I mean, if you plucked one of those and put it in Ohio, everybody would say it was Hopewell. But it does seem to be, they're different. They don't have anything quite as big as the Hopewell earthworks, but it seems like they are really going in a parallel direction with what was going on in Hopewell. And I think all of us are just anxious to learn more about what people were doing there. So more excavations, not just related to the earthworks, but what are the people doing there? What are their villages like? What are their communities like?
Yeah. The Amazons are very interesting. There's a lot going on there, isn't there? Lots going on in the Amazon.
Yeah.
Because again, they're gardeners, aren't they? They're doing horticulture, and it's not quite full on agriculture yet, but it's going towards that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's my impression.
Um,
That's certainly the case with the Hopewell, but that's
mm,
my impression for the South American groups as well. But I know so much less about that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Another thing I was going to ask you about as well is another thing that you find sort of all over the Americas, as far as I'm aware, is these sort of like ceremonial walkways and roadways. And there's the Hopewell Great Road. I don't know if you can talk about that a little bit.
Sure, the Great Hopewell Road is a set of parallel walls that comes off one of the southern gateways of the Octagon and assumes a perfectly straight line that I think goes 60 miles and connects the earthworks at Newark with those in Chillicothe. It has a sort of a checkered history because the earliest map is Caleb Atwater's 1820 map. And he suggests, just on the basis of talking to people who say, oh, yeah, I saw these walls through the forest, 12 miles south. He thinks they went 30 miles and connected with a river down there. And he's not traced that. He's just going on the basis of evidence. That's 1820. 48, Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis do their Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, which is actually the first publication of the Smithsonian Institution. They recognize, they acknowledge Atwater as a pioneer in this work, but they never refer to his claim that the walls might go 15, 20 miles south. They just have the map, the walls going squiggly due south, and the only reference is on the map. It says parallels 2.5 miles long. So if you follow those walls for 2.5 miles, you come to Ramp Creek. So they just assumed that's where it ended. And most of us figured that Caleb Atwater was kind of crazy and that his idea that went farther was nuts, because Squire and Davis, these Smithsonian scientists, said it stopped at the river, and many of the parallel walls that come out of Hopewell site stop at rivers. So sure, that's the idea that went further was crazy. But then I found an unpublished manuscript in the archives of the American Antiquarian Society, done by two brothers, James Salisbury and Charles Salisbury, and they were residents of Newark. James was a doctor that he goes on to invent Salisbury steak, by the way.
Oh,
They followed
very
those
nice.
walls to Ramp Creek, crossed Ramp Creek, found that they continued. In their paper, they say they've followed them for 6 miles through tangled swamps and over hills, still keeping their undeviating course. And they said they were still going. So, like, why don't they keep following them? It's crazy. And when I read that,
So they so
oh, go ahead.
so they gave up. They didn't keep following them.
Right. They just said, we're tired. It's time for lunch. We're going to go back. But in
Yeah.
fact, food research in America didn't really become a thing until quite a bit later. So it's kind of remarkable that they invested so much, even like the roads, the ancestral Puebloan roads in Chaco Canyon. They were noted by people early on, like the Salisburys, but mostly people were focused on Pueblo Bonito and the big monuments at the center. They didn't care so much about the roads. That becomes important later.
And so the Great Hopewell Road, I mean, has most of it been lost now, unfortunately, in development?
Yes, but some of it's being recovered now with LIDAR. There's a guy named
Oh,
Janie
amazing.
Davis with the High Department of Transportation that's used LIDAR and has found traces of it as much as 8 miles south of the Octagon. But it's on a perfectly straight line that's pointing to the center of Chillicothe. And that line happens to be at right angles to the sunset on the summer solstice, the alignment of that.
Wow. Just another thing to blow your mind.
I mean,
Absolutely amazing.
there's
And
so
so
many layers, yeah.
yeah, there really are. So just to get the geography right, so we have basically this sort of cluster of Hopewell sites in the Chillicothe Valley,
Yeah.
and then Newark Earthworks is 60 miles north.
Yeah, sort of to the northeast.
Yeah.
And there's
And
like
do we know
nothing in
anything about,
between.
I mean, is that where people were living in the in-between?
Possibly. I mean, because these people are scattered off in these little communities. One of the things about Newark, to get this geography, because all the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks in the UNESCO nomination, they're either clustered in Chillicothe, further to the west is the Fort Ancient, and then way to the north is the Newark earthworks. And the Newark earthworks are the northernmost of any of the big Hopewell earthworks. So it's really weird. It's really, this is like the Hopewell core. And then there's
Mm.
this other thing that I think is like the grand synthesis of Hopewell astronomy and geometry and archaeology all created into one composition, sort of up there by itself. It's not exactly by itself, though, because it's only 9 miles away from the Flint Ridge Flint quarries. Flint Ridge Flint is this beautiful multicolored flint that becomes the signature flint, really, of the Hopewell culture. It's their favorite flint more than any others. And so that's kind of a connection that maybe the Newark earthworks were projected there to get more access to that flint. I don't know about that, but it's no coincidence that those are close together.
Interesting, interesting. And the Newark earthworks, they are later than the Chillicothe earthworks.
I think so, but many of the Chillicothe earthworks and like the Fort Ancient earthworks have lots of radiocarbon dates. We've only got a tiny handful, 3 or 4 or 5 radiocarbon dates for Newark. They tend to focus more on like AD 300. So yes, I think Newark is later. I think all this geometry and astronomy is developed in Chillicothe, and some Michelangelo or Imhotep takes all that knowledge, goes up to Newark, and puts it all together in this singular composition. So we've got the circle and square. That's kind of like Hopeton, which was a circle and a square. We've got the circle and octagon at Newark, which is like High Bank Works, a circle and octagon. We've got a big oval that's filled with burial mounds, which is similar to Mound City, which was a square with rounded corners filled with burial mounds. So it's as if somebody said, we'll take these components, which are like the main components, and we'll go up and make one complete composition. And it's some people have said it looks like a drawing you'd make on a napkin, but it's really not. Because like the distance from the center of the circle that's connected to the octagon to the center of the great circle is exactly 6 diameters of the observatory circle. And the distance from the center of the octagon to the center of the square is also exactly 6 diameters of the observatory circle. So it's somebody conceived of it as a design and laid it out on the landscape in that way, incorporating all these different components, all of which comes from the knowledge that was put together in the Chillicothe region.
So it's this culmination of everything that's been going on for a few hundred years, and it comes together at Newark.
Yeah, I think it's
so
kind of
interesting.
And I think it's kind of like a monumental, the equivalent of the Large Hadron Collider or something, where cosmic forces are all being marshaled there to do good things.
Yeah. The climate was quite good, I think, in that time. It was a little bit warmer than it is today. Is that right? Do we know this?
I think that's right. It was a pretty stable climate. It was there's no evidence that climate change in terms of droughts and things had any impact on them. That's not what doesn't seem to be what ended the civilization either. It was a pretty nice period for the whole time, and Hopewell rises and falls all in that space of time without any particular. There's no environmental driver, no environmental crisis at the end.
So yeah, things are good. Things are good for these people, it seems. I mean, what are the main kind of differences between the Hopewell and the Adena who came before? Is there a connection between the two? Do we think that the Hopewell took over the Adena, or are they the same people? Is there a way of knowing?
I absolutely think they're the same people. I mean, some of the differences are, they live in the same kinds of communities. They all have circular earthworks that are their churches. The Adena continues something that starts even in the Archaic period of acquiring copper from the Great Lakes and shells from the Gulf of Mexico. Their interaction sphere isn't as huge as the Hopewell becomes, but it's the beginnings of it. For a long time, the Adena were thought to be a different people because their head shape was different. But we know now it was because of cranial deformation. It wasn't sort of intentional cranial modification or different biologies. It was just their babies were being strapped to cradle boards, which kind of made this artificial deformation of the skull. The Hopewell don't exhibit so much of that. But early archaeologists said, oh, look, they're different head shapes, so they must be different people. They're not different people. They just have their practices change a little bit, and then with Hopewell, they just explode. And the Dina doesn't stop. It continues in some places in Ohio and Kentucky right alongside Hopewell for at least a long time. Um, sort of like in Ohio, we have Amish people that farm in like an 18th century, 19th century fashion with wagons and things. That's the same sort of thing. These conservative Adena people in like southeastern Ohio continued to live their way of life parallel to what their cousins were doing in the Scioto Valley.
And they carried on with the cranial modification as well.
Yeah, I suppose. I've never researched the Adena to that extent, but yeah, I would assume that most of their cultural practices stayed the same.
Really interesting. Okay, so we have the Adena begin roughly when?
I suppose like about 800 BC or about 800
BCE. Yeah, and then they flow into the Hopewell. Soon we'll talk about the end, but I've got a couple of questions just before the decline of the Hopewell. Yeah, okay, so I was going to ask some questions about Hopewell art as well. So essentially we have these burial mounds. I read that there was one that was just essentially full of these effigy pipes. Some of them are in the British Museum today, so I've seen them, and they're really interesting. I guess, yeah, could you tell us a little bit about what would be found in the Hopewell mounds? Yeah. And I suppose, are these just elite items, or are they for everybody?
It depends on the objects, I think, because I think all these objects have their own history. And the pipes you mentioned are a really interesting example, because there are actually two sites where a large deposit of dozens and dozens of these animal effigy pipes were found, broken and buried in a mound. So the ones in the British Museum were from Mound City. The Tremper Mound down in southwestern Ohio they built at about the same time, had a similar cache of artifacts. And there's a art historian, Johanna Minich, examined both of those collections in detail. And what's fascinating, she thinks she's identified sort of master craftsmen or craftswomen, we don't know the gender, whose art is represented in both of the deposits. So indigenous people throughout there were like relying on some of the same artists to create these pipes that were then deposited separately. And I think she's got like 4 different masters identified, and the work of all 4 is present in those 2 disparate caches. And those they're very small pipes with very small holes. Only a small amount of this tobacco would have been in them. Some of the pipes are kind of idiosyncratic. There represents like all the animals practically in the environment. And I don't know if those were the particular spirit animals for a shaman or something like a shaman. And they were invoking that as they're going into the trance, they're staring into the eyes of their spirit animal. That's certainly the impression you get from looking at these pipes.
But and this is tobacco that's in the pipes.
Yeah, it's raw native tobacco, which is capable of inducing trances. I mean, it's very potent. And so it looks like in these early Hopewell sites, you have these shamans going into trances and doing things. But at Mound City and at Tremper, at some point, all of these people get together, turn their pipes in, they're smashed and broken and burned and buried in a mound. And then it seems like you get what we've referred to, perhaps wrongly, but as a priesthood that develops, that seems to take precedence over those more shamanistic seeming practices. And then those people are wearing regalia like copper cutouts and mica cutouts of claws and hands and things like that. So it seems like there is a kind of a cultural shift from maybe more shamanic religious practices that might be characteristic of Adena and early Hopewell to something very different that we see. And there we have that regalia that I talked about earlier that includes the obsidian from the Rocky Mountains and shells from the Gulf of Mexico and copper from southern Canada in really large quantities. And they get buried often with people as funerary objects, but often you just get a big, massive deposits of ceremonial regalia burned and buried by itself, as if they conducted some huge ritual, and then all of the regalia that was used in that ritual was all decommissioned and offered up to the gods, the spirits, whatever, and buried in a mound.
How interesting. Do we have any radiocarbon dates for the deposition of the effigy pipes at Mound City?
Yes, Mound City and Tremper are among the earliest of the Hopewell sites, as well as Hopeton, which is right across the river from Mound City. So those are really right at the beginning. Um, Newark, as I mentioned, is sort of in the middle with those like AD 300 or so dates. Um, we do have dates for lots of the sites, and we do get a sense of that. But we, obviously, for Newark especially, we need much more radiocarbon dating to get a real good understanding about the chronology, how these things were, when they were built, and if they were built all at once or built over a interlude.
Yeah, that deposition of all of those items, that's interesting. That's an event there. Something big has happened. A big shift, a big cultural shift. I mean, another question that I had was, how did they organize their societies? I mean, how much do we know about, we're not talking about kings, we're talking about potentially priests, but maybe not. But generally, these are small bands. Do we know what size the bands would be?
Um, the communities that we found are more like homesteads, a couple of families living together, in a couple of houses with a garden, and then if the soils become depleted, they just pick up sticks and move to a different place, maybe not so far away. Um, but then there's
Right.
obviously social connections between a lot of communities, and they'll get together for sort of the small religious services of these groups. But then they have an even bigger group which is whatever they conceived of as Hopewell. That's obviously a European imposed name, but something very much like that sort of defines this almost continent spanning culture, with all the ritual trappings that go along with it. Um, and those people come together to make even this huger community, a kind of a giant religious community that might be analogous to Catholicism or something, because that's a religion has different manifestations all over the place. A Catholic church in Guatemala is different from a Catholic church in Italy, but they all have some commonalities. And I think that's what we're seeing with Hopewell when we look at Hopewell in Missouri and Hopewell in Florida, and things like that. It's the core, some of the same iconography, some of the same symbolism, same core beliefs, but things get done differently a little bit in some different places.
Interesting, yeah, because another thing that I've looked at is we've got the Ohio Hopewell. That's mostly what we're talking about today. But there's this whole, almost taking up, it's the entire sort of east of the United States, and there's all these different subcultures of archaeological groups, and they're all sort of Hopewellian.
Yeah, I mean, there's Kansas City, Missouri Hopewell. There's Florida Hopewell. The Fort Center site in Florida. It's a circular ditch, not an earthwork, but that ditch is 1,200 feet in diameter, which is the same as Newark's Great Circle. So some of the
Wow.
geometry is there, probably some of the astronomy is there, but it's not built as an earthwork. It's built as a big circular ditch. So they're doing some things differently, but they're incorporating the important elements that are important to that community.
Mm. It's like somebody's visited the Chillicothe Valley and seen the things there, maybe taken part, and then took it back home.
Yeah, and
Really
then they sort
interesting.
of built it on their own cultural foundation. So it goes off in a little bit different
Yeah.
direction, but it has some of the same commonalities.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. The more I learn about history and archaeology, the more I realise that religion is such a prime mover of people. It's all over the world. Religion is how things get going often. This sort of communal coming together of people with like a shared idea of the world.
Yeah.
So I suppose we're coming to the end of the Hopewell now. Unfortunately, what happens? What happens at the end?
Nobody really knows, and I don't think any, 10 archaeologists agree. But if you look at the way Hopewell lived and then jump to the next period, which is the late woodland period, and then that's followed by the late pre-contact. If you look at what's going on in those two different cultures, um, my idea, I mean, Hopewell, these scattered communities, they're all cooperating. There is no evidence, zero evidence for warfare. No burials we've ever identified in Hopewell society have bashed in skulls or spear points stuck in them or broken arm bones from a perifracture or anything like that. None. There's no evidence. There's evidence for it before Hopewell, and there's more abundant evidence for it after. So Hopewell, peaceful society, egalitarian society, everybody's working together for a common purpose, living in scattered communities, growing crops, hunting, fishing, and gathering, but periodically all coming together for these communal events. After Hopewell, people are living in larger villages with walls around them, people buried in the cemeteries, sometimes, often, have perifractures, spears, or arrowheads, in this case, stuck in their ribs, bashed in heads. So one of the things that seems to me a plausible inference from those facts is that Hopewell was very successful for this time period, but perhaps they were victims of their own success. Population grew, and these little tiny communities that were sort of living in cooperation, suddenly there's more of them. And if a hunting gathering way of life, for example, depends upon having vast amounts of land, your village, you're hunting out all the deer, your soils are becoming depleted, you move to the next valley. And maybe you have a 50, 100-year cycle of movements as you move your community from one place to another to take advantage of, the replenished game in areas. Well, what happens if somebody builds another village in the valley that you were planning to go to next? So it's like, oh, suddenly I can't sort of go there. I have to deal with this depleted deer, and so maybe I can't get the deer I want, so I have to eat something else. And that sort of leads to competition. And sort of you get too many people living in a smaller area, I think that would inevitably lead to conflict. And everything the Hopewell did was based on cooperation. So once you push over that first domino of conflict, then people have to combine their communities for defense. If somebody's being obstreperous and sort of trying to take other land, then those communities get larger and larger, and you build walls around them, and there's evidence of fighting. So that's kind of one scenario that I've offered for why Hopewell collapses. And just as with dominoes, once you push that the domino, there's like a chain reaction, and it happens really fast. It also just may be that Hopewell couldn't sustain all that earthwork building, and people get fed up and saying, I'm tired of, spending all my summers building earthworks, and I got other things to be doing. And so maybe there was just a general being fed up with, sort of like with the Apollo program. Ray Hively, the astronomer, part of that. And he talks about that as being something like the Hopewell achievement, with all these people working together for this amazing thing. But once it happens, once you get the moon landing, suddenly the public's not interested anymore. It happened, and there were those other landings that followed.
It's been done.
Yeah. And so maybe the Hopewell had that kind of thing. It's like, well, we did that. We had the big world renewal ceremony, and why do we have to build more earthworks? So that may be partly involved too.
Just to briefly go back to the earthworks.
Yeah.
In terms of how long it took to make these things, are they singular events, or are they taking place over many years?
It depends on the site. Fort Ancient took hundreds of years. They built one part, and then built another part, and then built another part. And we've got lots of radiocarbon dates to demonstrate that. I've argued that the Newark Earthworks was built all at once, like within 10 years, because of its coherent design, and because with the kinds of societies that were involved, it had to be sort of like the designer with his or her influence and management to ensure that it was completed according to his design or her design. But I don't have the radiocarbon dates to support that. We have almost no radiocarbon dates because so much of the site is gone. But I've inferred that from all the intricacy of the design and how it's like a singular design that was maintained over the course of it. So it's possible it took longer. We just don't know. But it's probably different for different sites. But I know at the National Park Service, they think like the Hopewell Earthworks. There's evidence that the Hopewell Circle was built in 2 episodes, so maybe in 2 seasons. So the Great Circle probably also could have been built in something like that span of time. And in terms of being like 2 layers, there's probably evidence for that there too. So just the Great Circle, 2 seasons, maybe 2 or 3 seasons for the Circle and Octagon, another season maybe for the Square, and maybe a couple more seasons for the Circle and Octagon. So again, you could do it. They could have done it in a relatively short
Mm,
period of time. But
yeah,
because of
yeah.
the lack of study and the
Particularly
lack
if you're
of dates, we don't know how long it took. Go ahead.
just particularly if you're not all fighting each other, you can you can achieve a lot.
Exactly.
And then when they're not building these things anymore, the communal sort of community coming together to achieve a greater good has gone away. So it's kind of a sad end in a way. And then we have is it the late woodland culture that comes after?
Yeah, that they're living in larger communities. They start growing corn. Corn comes in about
Ah,
900 CE. And the
interesting. So the communities actually grow then when they're not at these religious sites.
well, yeah, probably. But the thing about corn,
Mm,
once you get that, the only advantage of corn, it's not less nutritious than a lot of these other foods are getting, but you can feed more people per acre with corn than with any of the other crops.
yeah. So corn comes in, warfare comes back, and then eventually the Fort Ancient culture comes in, right? That's at Fort Ancient.
Yeah.
And then there's a bit more movement of indigenous peoples, and then the Europeans arrive.
Yeah, and they ruin everything.
I suppose just to finish our conversation, we could talk, a little bit on that, on the sheer destruction that has been wrought in the last 200 years. But I mean, only in the last sort of 50 years, I think a lot of destruction has happened. Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and I'm just going on what I've read and what has been shared with me by indigenous peoples. But like in late Fort Ancient culture villages, you start getting European trade beads showing up. And doesn't mean Europeans are there. It means tribes, intermediate tribes that got European trade goods are trading them on. So, but already with that material culture is coming the infectious diseases introduced by Europeans. So it's likely that many of these Fort Ancient villages were decimated or more than decimated by European diseases because they interacted with other indigenous people who brought the diseases all unknowingly with them with the trade goods. I mean, we know this happens like in Florida with DeSoto comes through, and then the next people that go through find abandoned villages and dead people, and it's just a devastated landscape because everybody's dying from the diseases that they brought in. But the Europeans then really don't really
Mm.
know what's going on. So diseases sweep through, then Europeans come through like locusts, pushing people out of their territories, fighting them, killing them if they have to, or just displacing them. Um, and then they make treaties, but treaties at gunpoint, cede this land and we'll give you wonderful land out in Oklahoma or Kansas. And then they end up in a smaller plot of land than they were promised. And there's all these different tribes have the Trails of Tears stories, where they start with 600 people and end up with 50 people that survive the trip because they're not given food. They're not given wagons and horses. They're just forced to walk, and sometimes in the winter. And then you get the schools that are established to try to make the Indians into civilized people and systematically destroy their culture. Um, but so many of the tribes had such resilience that they found ways to subvert that and maintain some of their culture. Other tribes lost a lot. So yeah, our sort of beneficent efforts to civilize the American Indians were just tragic and horrible things to do to these indigenous cultures, and have resulted in, I think, a lot of ways that make it impossible to make some of these connections that we'd like to make. Sort of, and one of the extraordinary things about this is, even though these indigenous cultures have endured so much, um, a, a colleague of mine, actually my boss, Jen Altman, because of some work I did with Chief Ben Barnes, chief of the Shawnee tribe. There are 3 different Shawnee tribes, and Chief Glenna Wallace is chief of the Eastern Shawnee. Ben is chief of the Shawnee tribe. She says these people often don't know what they know because we've gone out to Oklahoma many times on consultation trips. And at first, Chief Barnes says he didn't like me very much because I'm sort of this arrogant archaeologist, well, but there was a moment. It was a consultation we were doing at the Eastern Shawnee Cultural Center, and we're in the museum. This is a lunch break, and the woman that was like in charge of the exhibit was showing me the exhibit, and we're at the case of showing the Shawnee drum. and it's a water drum, and it says that how it's all attached by these other things, and I'll talk about in a second. We're there talking. Chief Barnes walks by, and he starts joining in the conversation. And he starts telling me how in his own ceremonial practices, he has a water drum that's based on sort of like a metal kettle, and they stretch this leather hide on it. And he said, we attach the hide to the water drum by first we go to this very special place and get these perfectly round black pebbles. And then we use those to wrap around the edges and tie them off, and then we tie them all together, and that's how it keeps the drum head on the drum. And I'm looking at him like, perfectly round black stones. I said, when the Sipe earthworks, Hopewell earthworks, were excavated, they found 5 perfectly round black stones that had engravings on them. And I said, do you ever engrave these stones? And he said, no. But it became a conversation that over a couple of years, we ended up turning into an academic paper, because the archaeologist in the 1930s that excavated those black stones, he said, oh, those are marbles, where kids were playing marbles back then, even though there was no evidence of that game before Europeans got here. But so Chief Barnes and I wrote this paper saying, they're not marbles, they're drumstones. They're probably all that's left of the oldest drum we know of in Eastern North America, if we're right. And it's such an amazing honor to be co-authoring a scientific paper with a Shawnee chief, where he gets to say,
amazing.
And it couldn't have happened. It was like serendipity. I mean, I couldn't have gone to him and said, "Say, there's some things. What do you think about these Hopewell artifacts?" It just happened to be this confluence where we're there talking about something and things just came together. And I think that's what Jen meant. People, that they don't know what they know, but in the right context, it can come together. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, just going to say, because I mean, he's discovering at the same time as you're discovering, I suppose.
Yeah.
He's finding out, about his own people, his own ancestors, which is brilliant.
Yeah. And he said that's what really most impressed him most, was that the ceremonial practices that he was doing, that like he doesn't know their Hopewell ceremonial practices or even older. He just knows it's what like his grandfather taught him or something,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
You can trace it back though.
Super interesting. I mean, I was going to sort of talk about DNA, but it's this subject where it's in the West, we're all desperate to look at the DNA of our ancestors, but we live in a different cultural framework from the indigenous people, and looking at the DNA is not really a thing that's done, right?
Well, it is. Chief Wallace talked about when the tribes are involved in research. For example, there was controversy over Blue Jacket, historic Shawnee chief, who some said that, oh, he was so smart he must have been half white, or maybe he was white. And there are direct ancestors of Blue Jacket. And in an attempt to sort of quash that sort of racist trope, the ancestors agreed to have their DNA tested, and there were descendants of the von Swearingens or something who were supposed to be the ancestor of Blue Jacket, and they tested them, and there was no connection. So they were able to sort of debunk that myth with DNA. But that was a case that benefits the tribe. They're sort of eliminating the stupid racist trope of their leader. He was only their leader because he was half white, which is why he was so smart.
It's wild, isn't it? It's the same thing all over the world. I mean, people used to try and say that the pharaohs were white, in the 1800s and early 1900s. Yeah, because
brown people can't be smart.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, do we know who is descended from the Hopewell? I mean, can we ever find that out?
Well, I think it's pretty simple. I mean, I think it's like all the tribes in the Eastern Woodland, all the people in that interaction sphere came together. I mean, among the things that they probably did there, in addition to worshiping, were, since they lived in these small scattered communities, they were finding marriage partners, for their kids or something. And so I think, all those DNAs would be interwoven. And even if, and I suspect there were maybe the descendants of a few core tribes, in Ohio, like maybe, and I'm not guessing, but informed speculation, the Shawnee, the Miami, the Wyandot, maybe they're all here, or their ancestors are all here. But all these other tribes are coming in too, and they need their help to build the earthworks and to perform the ceremonies. And many of them go home, but many of them will stay and marry somebody in the community. So no single tribe could have done what the Hopewell did. So we're never going to be able to say the Shawnee built them or the Miami built them. It's all of them.
It's
It took all-
everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, it's great to know that, I mean, the Hopewell, they're still going, really. I mean, they're still among us against all the odds. Well, I suppose on that note, unless you have anything else you want to add, I think we can probably end it there.
Okay,
Thanks for talking to me. That was an absolutely incredible conversation. I've learned a lot.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Really, really
speaking to
great
you
talking
too.
to you.